All right. So Marr's saying we're going to need lots of different levels of description in order to sort of fully describe or fully understand any kind of human carrying out any kind of information processing task, um, or really even a non human carrying out any kind of information processing task. Sorry, there's a snowplow outside, finally. Okay, it's gone. What kinds of levels are we going to need? Well, he picks out three particularly important ones here. Let me see if I can zoom out on that. Here we go. So here is the basic layout of Marr's three levels of description for an information processing task. Level one is the computational level, and this level is trying to figure out what is the system our theory is trying to explain, and why does the system look the way it does instead of looking some other way. So this is about the kind of problem that we're trying to solve. What kind of a problem is it? What are its properties? And why does this particular problem have these properties instead of having some other kinds of properties? So that's already a fair bit of work. But then at level two here, which he refers to as the algorithmic level, we're also going to need to give an explanation of how humans or any other computing devices actually perform those computations associated with level one. All right, so in general, if we're talking about some process, it's going to have an input and an output and some algorithm for getting between inputs and outputs. Finally, at level three here, the implementational level, in terms of humans, this question is going to be, how is all of this encoded in the brain? Now, for a computer, the question would be, how is all of this encoded in a computer? But of course, most of what we're doing in this class is going to be about humans. We'll get there shortly, but let's think about some of our non-human examples first. So, here's what Marr says about these three levels. The critical point is that understanding computers is different from understanding computations. To understand a computer, one has to study that computer. To understand an information processing task, one has to study that information processing task. To understand fully a particular machine carrying out a particular information processing task, one has to do both things. Neither alone will suffice. So what does that mean? If we're eventually interested in figuring out how human eyes and brains are able to represent information about the external world, we're going to have to study human eyes and brains on the one hand, but we're also going to have to study the properties of the external world and how you might represent information about those properties. We can't do just one of the two. And he gives his first sort of elaborate computer metaphor here. I like all of these analogies or metaphors a lot from this chapter. They're all really clear and interesting. And this was one I asked about in the homework assignment. He talks about the system of reservations for airline computers. And interestingly, even though this system was invented, I think, in the 1960s, they are still using very much the same computer system for airline reservations today that they were 50 years ago. And that's in part because in order to switch it over to more modern hardware or software, you'd need to completely shut down the system for some amount of time. And that would be catastrophic for the airline industry. So they basically have barely upgraded their computerized reservation system over the last 40 or 50 years. Now, what's going on in this example? Well, there's an extremely complex way that airline reservations get made. And so, you might be trying to book a trip from Morgantown Airport to like Oslo, Norway. I once had to do that. And the computer is going to be responsible for trying to figure out how to get you from point A to point B and sell you a ticket, basically. But, in that particular case, you can't fly from Morgantown to Oslo. Instead, you're going to have to go through a series of intermediate points. So one possibility here would be Morgantown to Pittsburgh. And then from there, you're going to have more choices. You could go Pittsburgh to I think London, there is a direct flight these days, and then London to Oslo. You could go Pittsburgh to New York, and New York to somewhere in Europe, or maybe there's a direct flight to Oslo, or maybe there isn't. Maybe instead you want to start in Morgantown and go to Washington, D.C., and then see where you can get from Washington, D.C. It's a hard problem to solve. It's not an easy thing to do. Anybody who's ever messed around with airline itineraries knows that this is complicated. And so they have invented a software program that runs on a particular kind of computer that has some method of trying to solve this problem. The solutions aren't always perfect, but there is some definite algorithm that runs in this software and gives you some options for buying a ticket. Now, if you've ever been presented with a totally crazy suggestion about an airline itinerary, you know that this algorithm happens not to be perfect, but that's not really the point here. The point is, what if we wanted to study what the airline reservation system is doing, and all that you were given was the computer that it runs in. And actually, sorry, let's say the software too. You're given the computer with the airline software, and you're an expert software engineer, computer scientist, and you understand down to the circuit exactly what's happening inside that computer. The question is, are you going to be able to figure out how airline reservations work? And Marr's observation here is no, never in a million years will you be able to figure out the first thing about airline reservations, even if you fully understand the machine that those reservations are being implemented on. Why is that? Well, no matter what you figure out about the kinds of electrical activity and circuits opening and circuits closing and binary codes and zeros and ones that are going on inside that computer, you're never going to get anywhere with this task, because to understand what's going on in that program, you need to know something about planes and the world and geography. So you need to know, for instance, that Morgantown is a city in West Virginia, and it is on a different landmass and far away from Oslo, Norway. You need to understand what the relationship is between Morgantown to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to New York to Norway, whatever. You need to know something about the fact that airplanes are objects and that they are propelled from one place to another along a series of roughly two-dimensional coordinates that is the surface of the Earth. If you don't know these basic problems of what airline travel is, you're not going to have any idea whatsoever what's going on inside that computer, no matter how well you understand the computer, right? Because the computer is performing information processing tasks over representations, and the things that those representations are representing are airline flights from one place to another place in the external world. If you don't understand the physics and the geography of the world, that's not in the computer, and you're never going to recover it from the computer. You first have to have some basic theory of what the computer is doing. Right? That's the point of the airline example. And it's interesting. I mean, this point is being made in 1982. It probably wasn't even new then, but it continues to be highly relevant to modern cognitive science as well. And so I've brought in this kind of amusing example from a paper by Jonas and Cording, where they're doing very much the same thing, except they're taking this problem seriously in a sense. It's also kind of a joke in a different sense. But what they're doing here is essentially taking that airline reservation system example and actually doing it. They're like doing something like taking apart the airline reservation computer and probing it and seeing if they can recover anything about the airline reservation system, except instead of airlines and reservations, they're using old video games. All right. So what's going on here? Their overarching point is that just doing lots of exploratory research by looking at different kinds of activation and relationships within neuroimaging is not going to automatically tell us how cognition works, right? So they're arguing against a sort of strong reductionist approach where the only thing we need to do in order to figure out how human cognition works is to study brains long enough and get enough data so that we can understand what the brains are doing, and that will tell us how cognition works. They're trying to reiterate this point, which is not original to them, obviously, that that's not going to work. And this is very much by analogy to the human brain. So here they're going to try to understand a known artificial system, a classical microprocessor, by applying data analysis methods from neuroscience. We want to see what kind of an understanding can emerge from using a broad range of currently popular data analysis methods. So what did they choose here? They chose a classical early video game microprocessor. It's the processor from the Apple I, the Commodore 64, and the Atari video game system. And if you were my age, you would probably remember some of these machines. They were like roughly early 1980s types of early computers that could run certain kinds of kind of primitive but very fun games. These are old school video game systems. The microprocessor itself is big, but it's not intractably big. So they actually have a full wiring diagram of the entire microprocessor and a total level of understanding of what every single circuit in this entire machine is doing at any given time. In fact, they use a modern computer simulation of the processor, but it's going to work exactly the same. So they actually have a circuit by circuit understanding of the entire structure of this processor and its activity. Now, obviously, we don't have that for a human brain or any other animal's brain. But there seems to be this attitude in some corners of neuroscience that if we just had that level of understanding of a brain, we would have solved all the problems. And these guys are trying to make the point that that's absolutely not true. How are they going to make that point? Well, in this paper, they examine 3 different behaviors, that is, 3 different video games. The processes that they're going to study are the Donkey Kong process, the Space Invaders process, and the Pitfall process. And these are classic video games from the late 1970s, early 1980s. They're not terribly complicated. They're very, very famous, so I think they're betting on the fact that a lot of readers will remember these video games from their youth, at least if they're as old as I am. Yeah, and this is kind of the joke. So like at the level of cognitive stuff or mental stuff or behavior, what they're trying to study is how these video games work. And the question is, can we reconstruct these relatively simple video games from studying the full microprocessor of the machine on which they're implemented? All right, so as a first example here, they're going to run the games, right? And they're going to study the properties of what the processor is doing while the games are running and see what they can figure out about how the games work. Right? So the first one they do here is a simulated lesion study, and this is common in cognitive neuroscience. You either find somebody who is subject to a traumatic brain injury in a particular part of the brain, or you can actually temporarily disable small parts of the brain using electromagnetic phenomena. And then you ask what changes in the behavior when you take away part of the brain, right? So in the lesion studies, you would normally do that by comparing somebody with a brain injury to somebody without the brain injury and asking, well, what are the neural differences here and how do those correlate with differences in behavior? Lesion studies allow us to study the causal effect of removing a part of the system. We thus chose a number of transistors and asked if they're necessary for each of the behaviors of the processor. Right? In other words, we asked if we removed each transistor, would the processor still boot the game, that is, start the game up? And indeed, we found a subset of transistors that make one of the behaviors impossible. Right? This is so far a pretty direct analogy to how early lesion studies in the area of cognitive science and especially language often worked. Right? So what can we conclude from that? We can conclude that they're uniquely necessary for the game. Perhaps there's a Donkey Kong transistor or a Space Invaders transistor, and their point here is that that's ridiculous. Right? The machine is not made with a Donkey Kong transistor. It's not made with a Space Invaders transistor. The machine was invented before any of these games were. The fact that if you knock out part of the machine, the game fails to load, that can be for any number of reasons, but they're going to be at a much finer grained level of detail than the Donkey Kong behavior or the Space Invaders behavior. It's going to be particular kinds of informational resources or processes that are involved in some subpart of the game, and you can't get at that by looking at the microprocessor. All you can really do is say, well, if you knock this out, the Donkey Kong behavior goes away, and it has that in common with the Space Invaders behavior, but that's different from the Pitfall behavior. Therefore, this must be the Donkey Kong and Space Invaders part of the transistor. And, that's just not a valid inference. It just doesn't work, is their point here. No part of the transistor is specific to any of these games, but each of the behaviors, the games, is going to recruit different parts of the transistor for different aspects of their gameplay. Where in order to understand the gameplay, you'd have to look at the much higher level representation of how the games are coded in higher level programming languages, not in machine code of zeros and ones and transistors on or off. That's not how software works, basically. They then go through this elaborate process. They actually get some sort of electrical readouts of different components of the transistor, and they process them in ways that are actually real and happen in real cognitive neuroscience, and they produce something that is very much like an event-related potential from cognitive neuroscience, which is one of the principal ways that neuroscientists study cognitive processing. And their point is, look, we can get results that look exactly like a real ERP experiment on humans, and we're going to be able to single out specific oscillatory components of electrical activity that seem to correspond with particular behaviors, but these are not going to help us reconstruct the actual functioning of these games in any understandable way. They're going to be basically emergent. They're going to be epiphenomena of what the game is doing, and without understanding what the games are doing, this kind of data is not going to really help us solve the information processing task, not really going to help us describe the behavior of the video game system, right? So again, they're using this kind of funny example of video games and a microprocessor to make a very serious point, which is that even if we fully understand the hardware device on which a behavior is being encoded, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that we understand the behavior. And it's important to pursue different levels of explanation for each of these. Here's what they conclude. We find that many measures are surprisingly similar between the brain and the processor, but that our results do not lead to a meaningful understanding of the processor. The analysis cannot produce the hierarchical understanding of information processing that most students of electrical engineering obtain. It suggests that the availability of unlimited data, as we have for the processor, is in no way sufficient to allow a real understanding of the brain. And this is a very Marrian point, right? So, how does the processor actually work? Well, it has different types of subunits that can implement different kinds of logical operations in the software code for a game. Those logical operations are the real information that we need to process, but we don't know what those are by looking at the output of the processor. We have to understand the way that a hierarchical sequence of structured actions is going to be coded, and then we can think about how that might be implemented in the processor. But just looking at the output of the processor is not going to help us reconstruct what went into it if we don't have an understanding of software programming, basically, which is classical information processing. So, everybody agrees studying any complex information system requires multiple levels of description. And next crucial point here from Marr, there's going to be complex interactions between different levels.